The power was cut. The phones were dead. 3 brutal men had forced their way into the home of an elderly widow and her daughter. Their leader was driven by a dark and hateful lie. They thought it was 2 helpless women, easy prey in the autumn chill of northern Ohio. But they had made a fatal mistake. They hadn't seen the man watching from the shadows. He was a Navy SEAL, and at his side was his K-9 partner, a silent guardian who had just been given the one command every predator fears. A cold autumn wind swept in from Lake Erie, rattling the last of the dry leaves on the ancient oak trees and polishing the old brick streets of Port Sterling. It muted the sounds of the modern world, leaving only the distant clang of a railroad crossing and the whisper of the wind through the gables of the historic homes. It was a town caught between centuries, peaceful and slow. Walking through this quiet evening was Jake Donovan, a man who seemed to defy the stillness. In his mid-30s, Jake was built with the quiet, coiled energy of a predator at rest. Every movement was economical and precise, even on a casual stroll. He was on leave, a rare respite from the compressed violence and sun-scorched landscapes of his profession. He was a Navy SEAL, and he was trying his best not to be. Beside him, moving with the same silent grace, was Rico. The 6-year-old German Shepherd was not a pet, but a partner. His coat was a deep sable, and his intelligent amber eyes missed nothing. Unlike the other dogs they passed in the town square, Rico didn't sniff curiously at lampposts or pull at his lead. He walked at a perfect heel, his attention fixed on Jake, his senses drinking in the crisp air. He, too, was a soldier, ever vigilant. Jake breathed in the scent of wood smoke and damp earth, trying to let the tension in his shoulders ease. He was supposed to be decompressing. That was the word the doctors had used. To him, the quiet of Port Sterling was louder than any firefight. The slow pace of life here was alien. His was a world of decisive action and immediate consequence. Here, the biggest decision of the day seemed to be the choice between a perch fry and a bratwurst. He felt like a wolf being forced to graze. His gaze drifted over the intricate wrought iron of garden gates and the tall, dignified homes. It was all beautiful, but to his trained eye, it was all vulnerable. He neared the corner of Chestnut Street, known for its picturesque beauty. As he passed one of the largest homes, a tall, ivy-covered brick manor set back from the road, the scene changed. Inside the tall, ivy-covered house, the mood was anything but peaceful. Eleanor Gable, a woman in her 70s, stood by a tall window, her frame delicate but her gaze sharp. She was a classic Midwestern matriarch, proud and composed. But tonight, her composure was wearing thin. Her daughter, Megan, 40 and feeling every year of it, was on her knees on a worn oriental rug, surrounded by cardboard boxes. Megan had her mother's fine-boned features, but not her steel. Her eyes were puffy and her movements were heavy with defeat. "I don't know where we're going to put all this, Mom," Megan said, her voice strained as she taped another box shut. She had moved back home 2 weeks ago, her 15-year marriage ending not with a bang, a dramatic betrayal, but with the quiet, humiliating fizzle of indifference. She felt the weight of that failure in every box she packed. Eleanor turned from the window. "We'll find room, dear. We always do." But Eleanor was hiding her own gnawing fear. The house was too big. The taxes were too much. The dwindling finances were a secret she kept more closely guarded than the family silver. Megan's return was both a comfort and a terrifying new expense. Megan sighed, pushing her hair back. "It just feels so wrong, selling Dad's things, selling my things. It all feels wrong." Eleanor walked to an open box on the grand piano. She reached inside and pulled out a small, dark velvet case. She opened it. "Not everything is being sold, Megan. Some things we keep. Some things are who we are." Inside the box, nestled on faded satin, was an intricate locket. It was a spray of buckeye leaves and blossoms crafted from platinum and diamonds with a deep, star-like sapphire at its heart. It was the sterling locket, a family heirloom rumored to be worth a fortune. It was also their last line of defense against financial ruin. Megan looked at it, her eyes welling up again. "It's beautiful, but it feels like a relic from a life that doesn't exist anymore." "Nonsense," Eleanor said, her voice finding its familiar steel. "It exists because we're still here. Now help me with this armchair. It's blocking the secretary desk." They were women under siege, not by force, but by circumstance. Outside, in the deepening twilight, Jake and Rico continued their patrol. They reached the alley that ran alongside the Gable property. The alley was dark, overgrown with vines that smelled cloyingly sweet in the damp air, and Rico stopped. He didn't pull. He didn't bark. He simply stopped, planting his feet on the cracked pavement. Jake felt the subtle shift immediately. The hair along Rico's spine was raised, not in aggression, but in alert. "What is it, buddy?" Jake whispered, his hand resting on the dog's head. Rico didn't look at him. His gaze was locked on the deepest part of the alley. Then he did the one thing that always made Jake's blood run cold. It wasn't a growl. It was a low, deep rumble that vibrated in his chest. It was the signal Rico was trained to give. Not for a cat. Not for a raccoon. It was his signal for a human threat. Jake went still. The vacationing tourist vanished. The seal took his place. "Show me," he whispered. His eyes scanned the shadows. At first, nothing, just darkness, trash bins, and the thick, damp smell of vegetation. He listened, filtering out the sounds of the town. Nothing. Then he saw it. Tucked deep into the narrow space, almost completely obscured by the overgrown bushes and the gloom, was a vehicle. It was a dark, unmarked utility van. It was parked deep in the narrow space where no vehicle should be, its nose pointed out for a fast exit. Jake could just make out that its tires were thick with mud, despite the clean city streets. A cold, familiar certainty settled in Jake's stomach. This wasn't a delivery van. This wasn't a repairman. This was a predator's hide. He gave a silent hand signal, a closed fist that Rico knew well. "Quiet, observe." Rico lowered himself into a crouch, his body perfectly still, his eyes glued to the alley. Jake didn't reach for his phone. He didn't call out. He knew that in these situations, the first one to make a sound is the first one to lose. He backed away, drawing Rico with him, melting into the deeper shadows of a massive oak tree across the street. The gloom swallowed them, hiding them from view. The game had changed. They were no longer just out for a walk in the evening. They were on watch. The atmosphere inside the dark utility van was the polar opposite of the historic, windswept charm outside. It was stale, smelling of old coffee, damp wool, and the faint, metallic scent of fear. From this cramped metal box, the Grand Gable residence looked like a fortress, its lights casting a soft, warm glow through the twilight. In the driver's seat, a man sat perfectly still, watching. This was Dylan Deke Harding. To a stranger, Deke was unremarkable. Average height, average build, with the kind of face you'd immediately forget. It was his greatest strength. But behind his dull brown eyes, a cold, meticulous fire burned. He knew this house. He knew its sounds, its creaks, and its secrets. He'd played in that alley as a boy, waiting for his father to finish his long days of service. The man in the passenger seat was his opposite. They called him Mickey. He was thin and wiry, his pale skin slick with a nervous sweat despite the cold. His energy was that of a frayed high-voltage wire, and he couldn't stop moving. His fingers, stained and scarred, were tapping a fast, frantic rhythm on the handle of the hunting knife in his lap. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was like a crazed insect in the van's tense silence. "How much longer, Deke?" Mickey whispered, his voice dry and raspy. "It's cold. I just need this to be done." "It'll be done when I say it's done," Deke replied without looking at him. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "You just do your part, Mickey. No surprises. Just like we planned." Yeah, I know the plan," Mickey muttered, his eyes darting from the house and back again. "The old lady, the daughter. Easy." In the back, surrounded by heavy canvas bags, was the third man. Bull was a mountain of muscle, his head shaved, his neck as thick as a telephone pole. He said nothing. He didn't have to. Bull was a blunt instrument, and he was simply waiting to be used. He was methodically testing the tension of a pair of bolt cutters, the metal groaning softly under his powerful hands. Deke ignored them both. His focus was entirely on the house. This wasn't a random robbery. This was a homecoming. He remembered his father, a man who gave 20 years of his life as head groundskeeper and handyman for the Gable family, a man who could polish silver until it shone like a mirror and keep the gardens like a slice of heaven. And Deke remembered the day they were thrown out. He was 12. He remembered the shame, the tears in his father's eyes, the accusation of theft over some worthless piece of jewelry. His father had sworn his innocence, but they were cast out, their lives ruined, ending up in a small, damp apartment across the river. His father died 5 years later, a broken man who never stopped claiming he was framed. Deke's eyes went to an upstairs window. She was in there, old lady Gable, the one who had smiled so sweetly as she signed his father's final paycheck. "She has it," Deke whispered, so quietly the others barely heard. "Has what?" Mickey asked, his tapping stopping. "The locket," Deke said, the name tasting strange on his tongue. "The sterling locket. My dad told me about it, worth a fortune. She kept it hidden while my family starved." The lie had taken root in Deke's heart so long ago that it had become his truth. The worthless piece of jewelry his father had actually been caught stealing, an antique silver pocket watch, had been twisted in his memory, magnified by years of resentment, into the legendary locket. He wasn't here to rob. He was here to collect a debt. He was here for justice. He watched the house, waiting. The lights in the downstairs library went out. Good. Then the main living room. One by one. The house grew dark. Finally, the light in the master bedroom, the one he'd been watching, blinked off. The house was asleep. Deke let out a slow, cold breath. It's time. The van doors opened, soundlessly, like shadows detaching from a wall. They moved with practiced speed. Mickey, for all his nerves, was quick, scrambling up a drainpipe to the junction box. With a snip of wire cutters, the house's phone line was dead. Then he disabled the external alarm panel. Bull moved to the side door, the old servant's entrance that Deke knew was the weak point. It was secured with a heavy, modern padlock, but it was no match for Bull. He set the bolt cutters. There was a single, muffled crunch as hardened steel bit through the shackle. The lock sprang open. Bull eased the door open, a dark rectangle opening into the house's utility room. Deke went in first, followed by Mickey, his knife now drawn and gleaming. Bull closed the door behind them, plunging the alley back into darkness. They were in. Across the street, hidden in the deep shadows of the ancient oak, Jake Donovan had seen it all. He and Rico hadn't moved, had barely breathed. They were two statues carved from the night. Jake had watched the lights go out one by one. He had seen the dark shapes detach from the van. He had seen the smaller, quicker man scale the drainpipe. Then he'd seen the light in the house's small side window, a dim utility light, perhaps left on in a kitchen or mudroom. He watched it flicker and then it went dead. That wasn't a bulb burning out. That was a breaker being thrown. It was a deliberate, controlled act. Rico sensed the change in Jake, the sudden tension in his body, and rose to his feet, muscles coiled, ready. Jake placed a hand on the dog's neck, a silent command to wait. His heart wasn't racing. It had settled into the slow, powerful beat of work. He was no longer on leave. The fog had lifted, and the world was terribly clear. They were inside, and they belonged to him. Upstairs in the master bedroom, the world was still safe. Eleanor Gable sat in her favorite armchair, a book lying unread in her lap. She was listening to her daughter, Megan, moving around in the adjoining bathroom, the splash of water, the click of a jar being closed. They were normal, comforting sounds, but they didn't soothe the knot of anxiety in her stomach. She was a woman who knew the sounds of her own house. She'd lived within its walls for 50 years. She knew the creak of the third stair, the groan of the pipes in winter, the sigh of the settling foundation. "I think I'm going to turn in, Mom," Megan said, emerging from the bathroom in a silk robe. Her face was scrubbed clean of makeup, making her look younger and more vulnerable. "All right, dear," Eleanor said, her eyes lingering on her daughter. Are you feeling any better?" Megan managed a weak smile. "I'm just tired. I think this move. It's a lot." She walked to the window, pulling back the heavy velvet curtain to look out at the windswept street below. "It's so quiet out there." The words were barely out of her mouth when a sound came from downstairs. A soft, muffled thud. Megan tensed. "What was that?" Eleanor frowned. "I'm not sure. Probably just the house settling," Megan said, letting the curtain fall. She was trying to convince herself. "It's an old house. It makes noises." "That noise was new," Eleanor said, her voice low. She knew it wasn't the groan of old wood. It was the sound of an impact. Before Megan could answer, the lamp on the bedside table flickered. It blinked once, twice, and then went dead. The room, along with the entire house, was plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. "Mom." Megan's voice was sharp with sudden fear. "I'm here." Eleanor's hand fumbled for the small flashlight she kept on her nightstand. Her fingers found the cold metal, but she couldn't find the switch. "The breaker must have tripped," Megan said, her voice high. She was moving in the dark toward the door, guided by memory. "I'll go check." "No." Eleanor's voice was a command. "Don't leave this room." Megan stopped. "Mom, you're scaring me." "The phone," Eleanor whispered. "Call 911. Megan's hand, already trembling, pulled her cell phone from her robe pocket. The screen flared to life, a single beacon illuminating their pale, frightened faces. She tapped the screen. "No, Mom. No signal, not a single bar. The Wi-Fi is gone, too. Look." She held out the phone. The words "no service" were displayed in stark relief. This was not an accident. This was not a storm. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The muffled thud, the power loss, the jam signal. It was a coordinated, tactical invasion. And then they heard it, a new sound, far more terrifying than the first. Footsteps. On the grand staircase. Not the creak of a settling house, but the heavy, deliberate tread of more than one person. Someone was in their home. The door, Megan. Lock the door, Eleanor hissed. Megan scrambled to the bedroom door, fumbling in the darkness for the old brass skeleton key in the lock. She turned it, hearing the heavy clunk of the deadbolt. It felt small, impossibly small. In the corner, Eleanor said, her mind racing. Your father's fireplace poker. Megan crept to the corner by the wardrobe, her hands finding the heavy, brass-handled poker. She gripped it, her knuckles white. It was a pathetic weapon, but it was all they had. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. They paused. The silence returned, thick and heavy. Eleanor and Megan stood frozen, their backs against the far wall, listening. The silence was broken by a soft, polite knock on their bedroom door. Megan let out a choked sob. It was a game. Go away. Megan yelled, her voice trembling. We've called the police. They're on their way. A low, amused chuckle came from the other side. I don't think so. Then, a heavy, violent thud slammed against the door. The old wood groaned and the frame vibrated visibly. Mom! Megan cried, moving to stand in front of her mother. Another thud, harder this time. Splinters flew from the doorframe. Eleanor grabbed Megan's arm. Stay behind me. The third impact wasn't a shoulder. It was a direct kick to the lock. With a shattering crack of wood and metal, the lock mechanism broke. The door flew open, slamming against the antique wallpaper. 3 dark silhouettes filled the doorway, framed against the dim light of the hallway. They were in. One stepped forward into the faint moonlight filtering through the window. It was Deke. He let his eyes adjust, taking in the scene, 2 terrified women, the shattered perfume bottles on the floor, the useless poker. He smiled, a thin, cold smile. Welcome home, Mrs. Gable, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. You've redecorated. I don't like it. For a second, no one moved. Then rage, pure, adrenaline-fueled rage, surged through Megan. She saw her mother, frail and terrified, and something inside her snapped. Get out! She screamed, lunging forward. Get out of our house. She raised the heavy poker, swinging it wildly at the nearest silhouette. It wasn't Deke. It was Bull. Bull didn't even flinch. He caught the poker in midair as if it were a child's toy. He ripped it from her grasp, the force of the pull spinning her around. And then, with a brutal, casual efficiency, he hit her, not with a punch, but with a powerful open-handed slap. The sound, sharp and ugly, echoed in the quiet room. It was the sound of a promise being broken, the sound of violence shattering a life. Megan was thrown backward, her head cracking against the corner of a dresser. She didn't even scream. She simply crumpled to the floor, stunned and disoriented. An angry red welt was already blossoming on her cheek. Megan! Eleanor shrieked. It was a high, horrified sound, torn from the depths of her soul. That sound acted as a trigger. Mickey, who had been vibrating with anticipation, shot forward. His nervous energy exploded into action. He crossed the room in 2 bounds, his knife appearing in his hand as if by magic. He grabbed the thin fabric of her robe, yanking her out of the chair. He pressed the flat, cold blade of the hunting knife against her throat. Shut up, he hissed, his face close to hers, his eyes wide and manic. Shut up, old woman, or I'll shut you up for good. Across the street, the wind-lashed oak was no longer part of the scenery. It was a listening post. Jake Donovan and Rico were 2 predators hidden in the gloom, their senses merged. The first sound that cut through the damp air was the splintering of the bedroom door. It was distant, but to Jake's trained ears, it was as loud as a gunshot. It was the sound of a breach. He waited, his entire body a compressed spring. His calculations were instant, cold, and precise. 3 men inside. Minimum 2 victims. Neighbors? Unlikely. The old homes were built of brick and plaster. Sound didn't travel well. Police. He heard no sirens. Phone. He glanced at his own. Full bars. But he knew better. The first thing a professional crew would do is cut the landline. And the second would be to jam the local cell signal. He wouldn't waste time trying to dial 911. Then came the second sound. It was high, sharp, and full of terror. Megan. It was a woman's scream, a mother's scream. It was the starting pistol. Jake didn't wait. The adrenaline didn't make him shake. It made him still. It brought the cold, clean focus he had spent a decade mastering. The world became simple. There was a threat. There were victims. There was him. His decision was made before the scream had faded. He wasn't waiting for a patrol car. He was the only help they had. He moved. He didn't run. He flowed across the street, a dark shape detaching from the shadow of the oak. The gloom was his ally, swallowing him instantly. Rico moved at his heel, a silent four-legged shadow. Jake put his hand on Rico's neck. "Quiet," he whispered. Rico's body tensed, acknowledging the command. The third sound reached them as they hit the sidewalk in front of the house. It was a sharp slap followed immediately by the tinkle of breaking glass. It wasn't a window. It was small glass objects like a vase or perfume bottles. It was the sound of direct, personal violence. Jake was already moving through the front gate, his eyes scanning the fatal funnel of the main entrance. Too obvious, too loud. He had to use their own entrance. He slipped into the dark alley, the same one where the van was parked. He found the side door. As he expected, the heavy padlock had been cut in two, hanging uselessly. The door was slightly ajar. A black rectangle of absolute darkness. They were inside. He gave his next command to Rico, a soft touch on his back. "Watch." Rico moved forward, his nose low, tasting the air. He didn't enter, but stood at the threshold, his ears swiveling, sampling the scent of the intruders, of the fear, of the house itself. Jake reached into his pocket, his hand closing around the cool metal of his EDC, his everyday carry. It wasn't a gun. He was on leave in a historic neighborhood. He had his minimalist kit, a small, high-lumen LED flashlight, and clipped to the inside of his waistband, a 7-inch cobber knife. His tools were simple, but in his hands, they were lethal. He clicked on the flashlight, his thumb over the lens, a technique that allowed only the faintest sliver of light to escape and preserve his night vision. He scanned the mudroom, boot prints, wet, 3 sets. He was at the point of entry. He was about to go in blind. He paused one more second to listen, and that's when he heard the voices from the top of the main stairs. They were crystal clear. "Please, please don't hurt her." It was the older woman's voice, Eleanor's, high with terror, but laced with a strange, defiant strength. "Take whatever you want. Just leave her alone." "What I want." Then the man's voice. "Deke." It was cold. It was calm. And it was filled with a chilling personal venom that made the hairs on Jake's neck stand up. "What I want, Mrs. Gable." Deke's voice echoed down the polished wood of the stairs. "I want everything. I want everything you took from my family. I want everything you owe." Jake stood perfectly still. The air left his lungs. This wasn't a simple robbery. This wasn't a smash and grab. This was personal. This was an execution. He looked at the dark threshold. The rules of engagement had just changed. This wasn't about property. This was about survival. He knew with absolute certainty that these men had no intention of leaving any witnesses. He looked at Rico. The dog was already looking at him, a deep, quiet intelligence in his eyes, waiting for the final command. Jake switched off his flashlight, plunging them back into darkness. He drew the cobber, the blade sliding from its sheath with a sound like a whisper. He gave the final command, his voice barely a breath. "Follow." Together, the man and his dog slipped through the open door, swallowed by the darkness of the house. The darkness inside the house was absolute. It was a physical presence, a thick, heavy blanket that swallowed sound and light. Jake Donovan stood in the mudroom, one hand on the hilt of his knife, the other on Rico. The dog was his world, compressed into a breathing, sensing instrument. Jake rested his left palm lightly on Rico's back, right between his shoulder blades. He wasn't leading the dog. The dog was leading him. He could feel the micro-movements of the animal's muscles. A slight twitch to the left meant a clear path. A subtle tensing meant an obstacle. A low, nearly imperceptible rumble in the dog's chest meant the scent of the intruders was strong. They moved as one. They were two ghosts in a house that was not their own. They passed through the kitchen. Jake could smell old coffee, the faint scent of cinnamon, and something else that was sharp and acrid. The coppery scent of raw fear. It was drifting down from the second floor. Upstairs in the master bedroom, that fear was a living thing. "I'm not going to ask again, Eleanor," Deke said. His voice was no longer sarcastic. It was a low, dangerous hiss. "The locket. Where is it?" Eleanor was on the floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Mickey's knife was still on her, but his attention was divided. He kept glancing at the door, at the valuables on the dresser, his body trembling.
I don't know," Eleanor whispered.
It was a weak lie, but it was all she had. "Liar," Deke snarled. He turned his head to the mountain beside him. Bull, she needs convincing. The daughter, make her talk. Bull, who had been standing guard at the door, smiled. He turned. Megan was still on the floor where she'd fallen, her vision blurry. She tried to scramble backward, but there was nowhere to go. The giant bent down, his massive hand bypassing her arm and taking a fistful of her dark hair. With one brutal motion, he yanked her head back, exposing her throat. Tell him. Bull's voice was a low growl. Where's the safe? Where's the jewel? We don't have it. Megan cried, tears of pain and terror streaming down her face. Please. Wrong answer. Bull didn't hit her again. He did something worse. He slammed her head backward, using her own body as a hammer. The back of her skull connected with the solid oak bed frame with a sickening, hollow thud. Megan's cry was cut off in a gasp. Her body went limp, her eyes rolling back as she slumped to the floor, unconscious or close to it. No. The scream that tore from Eleanor Gable's throat was not one of fear. It was a sound of pure, primal rage. The frail, 70-year-old woman was gone. In her place was a lioness. She saw a heavy, crystal-based lamp on the nightstand. With an incredible burst of strength, she grabbed it, ripping the cord from the wall, and threw it with all her might. It flew across the room and smashed squarely against the back of Bull's huge, shaven head. The crystal shattered, the lamp falling uselessly to the floor. It didn't hurt him, but it stunned him. It was a gnat attacking a bull. He turned slowly. His face, which had been a mask of simple cruelty, was now dark with fury. He forgot the locket. He forgot Megan. He forgot Deke's orders. He saw only the old woman who had dared to strike him. You! He roared, taking a step toward her. Bull! No! Deke yelled, realizing his mistake. We need her. But the bull had been let loose. Bull crossed the room in 2 strides. Eleanor tried to back away, but there was nowhere to go. He didn't punch her. He didn't slap her. He simply pushed her. He placed his massive palm on her small chest and shoved. It was the force of a 300-pound man against a 110-pound woman. Eleanor was lifted off her feet. She flew backward, her frail body slamming into the tall mahogany wardrobe. Her head hit the wood with a sharp crack. She slid down the polished surface, crumpling to the floor in a heap of bones. She didn't move. Her eyes were wide with shock, but she wasn't breathing. The air had been stolen from her lungs. Downstairs, Jake heard it all. He had just reached the base of the grand staircase, Rico at his side. He'd heard the man's command, make her talk. He'd heard the wet, ugly thud of Megan's head hitting the bed frame. He heard Eleanor's roar of no. And the shatter of the lamp. And he heard the horrible, final crack of Eleanor's body hitting the wardrobe. A cold, clean rage enveloped him. This was no longer a rescue. This was pest control. He started up the stairs, Rico moving with him, step for step, silent as the night. In the bedroom, Deke was furious. You idiot. He screamed at Bull. You killed her. We've got nothing. He rushed to Eleanor's side, checking for a pulse. No, wait. She's alive. The chaos was too much for Mickey. His greedy, agitated mind couldn't handle the screaming and the violence. He just wanted the stuff. I'm checking the other rooms, Mickey said, his voice shaking. The safe. It could be in the study. Fine, Deke yelled, distracted by Eleanor's still form. Go find it. Just get out of here. Mickey, relieved, slipped out of the master bedroom, a small flashlight in one hand, his knife in the other. He was going treasure hunting. The hallway was dark, and he felt brave. He did not know that Jake and Rico had already reached the second-floor landing. As Mickey exited the bedroom, Jake pressed himself and Rico back, melting into a deep alcove in the hall, a space designed for a statue or a small table. It was a pocket of pure blackness. Mickey started down the hall, his back to the master bedroom. He was careless, his flashlight beam dancing on the walls, his mind on jewelry and cash. He was completely unaware. He walked past the alcove. Like a shadow detaching from the wall, Jake moved. Before Mickey could even register the change in the air, Jake's left arm was around his throat, his hand clamped firmly over Mickey's mouth and nose, cutting off any sound. His right arm came around, his bicep pressing into one side of Mickey's neck, his forearm into the other. He applied pressure, a perfect, silent rear naked choke. Mickey's body erupted in a frantic, silent panic. He kicked, his legs flailing uselessly. The flashlight fell to the carpet, its beam spinning wildly. He tried to stab backward, but Jake held his body too close. Jake held the choke. He was calm. He counted, 1, 2. 3. Mickey's struggles weakened. His body tensed. And then at the 12-second mark, he went completely limp, unconscious. Jake didn't let go. He held for another 5 seconds to be sure. He gently lowered the man to the floor. 1 down. He looked at the unconscious man. He had to be secured. Jake saw a guest room door a few feet away. He grabbed Mickey under the armpits and, with Rico's silent help, dragged the dead weight of the man into the room. He laid him on the floor, took his knife, and exited, closing the door behind him. The antique door had a skeleton key in the lock. Jake took the key, stepped back into the hall, and locked the door from the outside. He stood in the hallway, the key in one hand, the knife now in the other. He looked at Rico. 2 to go, and they were both in the master bedroom with the hostages. The hallway was a tomb, silent, except for the faint, ragged breathing coming from the master bedroom. Jake Donovan stood in the darkness, the heavy brass key from the guest room feeling cold in his palm. He had pocketed it. His knife was in his hand. 1 down, 2 to go. He slid along the wall until his shoulder rested against the doorframe of the master bedroom. He was a creature of shadow, his eyes adjusted, his ears filtering every sound. Inside, the scene was one of brutal stillness. Eleanor lay motionless by the wardrobe. Megan was a crumpled shape near the bed. Deke was breathing heavily, not from exertion, but from simmering rage. "You idiot," he said, his voice a low hiss at Bull. "You almost finished her. We need her awake." He knelt beside Eleanor, his fingers checking the pulse in her neck. "She's fading. Get the other one. Get her up." Bull, his adrenaline ebbing, looked confused. He was the hammer and he wasn't good at much else. He lumbered over to Megan and roughly grabbed her arm, shaking her. "Get up." Megan moaned, her head swimming. The world was a mess of pain. "Right now," Deke said, getting to his feet. His meticulously built plan was crumbling. The old woman was unconscious. The locket was still hidden, and his most volatile man was missing. "Mickey," Deke said, his voice low. He looked at the open doorway. "Mickey?" Silence, only the pained gasps from Megan as Bull hauled her halfway to her feet. "Where is he?" Deke said, almost to himself. He looked at Bull. "Did he go downstairs?" "He said he was checking the study," Bull grunted, his attention now on Megan, who was leaning against the bed, barely able to stand. "It's been too long," Deke whispered. A cold fear, colder than his anger, was starting to creep in. Mickey was weak and unreliable, but he wasn't quiet. "Mickey!" Deke yelled, his voice echoing into the hall. And the hall, which should have been empty, which should have been his domain to command, remained silent. Jake pressed himself tight against the wall just outside the door, not breathing. He heard the shift in the man's voice. He heard the curiosity turn to confusion. And now, the first flicker of panic. "He's gone," Deke said, his voice flat. He wasn't just a thief. He was a leader whose plan was dissolving. Had Mickey turned on him? Had he taken his cut and run, or? Deke's eyes darted around the room and then, for the first time, to the dark doorway. He stared into the blackness of the hall. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel it. They were not alone. "Bull," Deke said, his voice changing, hardening. He was no longer a man collecting a debt. He was a cornered animal. "We've got a problem." He reached behind his back and pulled a small handgun from his waistband. The click as he released the safety was deafeningly loud in the small room. Bull's head snapped up. He understood that sound. "The girl," Deke ordered. "Bring her here." He was done playing games. Bull grabbed Megan, his massive arm circling her waist, and dragged her toward Deke. Megan was too weak to fight, her feet dragging on the priceless rug. "I know you're out there," Deke yelled into the empty hall. "I don't know who you are, but you picked the wrong house." He grabbed Megan's robe, yanking her in front of him. He pressed the cold muzzle of the pistol to her temple. Megan, who had been in a fog of pain, was suddenly, horribly lucid. The feel of the metal on her skin sent a current of pure, unmixed terror through her. "No, please," she sobbed. "Shut up," Deke snarled, holding her tight. He was using her as a shield. "Come out, show yourself, or I'll end her right now. I swear to God." From his position in the hall, Jake saw it all. He saw the shift in power. He saw the glint of the gun, and his entire world, his entire tactical calculation froze. He couldn't move. He had a knife. They had a gun, a hostage, and a giant. He was a SEAL, but he wasn't a magician. He couldn't close the 15 feet to the gunman before the man could pull the trigger. Any move he made would be a death sentence for Megan. He was pinned. The frustration was a bitter taste in his mouth. He was forced to wait. In that agonizing, suspended moment, the impossible happened. Eleanor Gable, lying broken on the floor, was not unconscious. The impact had taken her breath, not her mind. She had been lying in agony, her vision swimming, the world a swirl of dark shapes. But she was a fighter. She had spent the last 2 minutes willing her lungs to take in air again, one shallow, painful sip at a time. Her vision was clearing. She saw Deke. She saw Bull. She saw her daughter, Megan, with a gun to her head. And she saw something else. In the dark frame of her bedroom door, she saw a man. He was not one of them. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and he was absolutely, perfectly still. He was a shadow, a statue of pure, focused intent. He was holding a knife. He was help. He was salvation. But she saw his stillness. She saw his eyes locked on the gun. She understood. He couldn't move. She looked at Deke. He was screaming, his body trembling with adrenaline. He was on the balls of his feet, his attention focused on the hall and his hostage. His left foot, in its heavy boot, was only inches from her hand. Eleanor Gable, a 70-year-old woman with what felt like broken ribs, made her choice. She would not die lying on the floor. She would not watch her daughter be executed. She gathered the last embers of her strength. As Deke shifted his weight, preparing to scream again, Eleanor's hand, thin and liver-spotted, shot out from her robe. It wasn't a weak grasp. It was a claw, her fingers locking around Deke's ankle, and she pulled. Deke never saw it coming. He was poised on a razor's edge, and the ground had betrayed him. His ankle was jerked out from under him. His balance shattered. "What the?" he yelled, stumbling forward, his center of gravity gone. The gun waved wildly, no longer aimed at Megan. He didn't fall, but he was off balance, and it was all Jake needed. The instant Deke's ankle was grabbed, before he had even begun to stumble, Jake was in motion. The command was not a shout. It was a low, explosive sound. "Rico." It was the trigger. Rico, who had been waiting in the hall, a compressed spring of 90 pounds of muscle, launched from the shadows. He didn't go for Deke. He didn't go for the gun. He went for the mountain. Bull had just turned his head, confused by Deke's sudden stumble. He saw a black and tan missile clearing the doorway. He had no time to react. Rico was trained to disable the primary weapon. In this case, it was Bull's arms. The dog leapt, his jaws closing with over 1,000 pounds of pressure on Bull's right bicep. Bull's scream was not human. It was the bellow of a steer, a sound of pure agony and shock as the dog's teeth sank deep into muscle. He forgot the hostages, forgot Deke, and looked down in horror at the animal hanging from his arm. It was perfect chaos. At the exact same moment, Jake moved. He didn't run. He took 2 fast, precise steps into the room. He ignored the screaming giant and the dog. His target was Deke. Deke was still struggling for balance, trying to bring the gun up, his eyes wide with horror at the dog. Jake was on him, his left hand shooting out, not for the gun, but for Deke's wrist, clamping it in an iron grip, pinning the gun against Deke's own chest. His right hand, holding the cobber, came up, but he didn't use the blade. He didn't need to. He used the pommel, the heavy steel butt of the knife. He struck Deke with a short, brutal jab directly under the chin. Deke's teeth snapped together with a crack. As Deke's head snapped back from the blow, Jake twisted. He ripped the gun from Deke's spasming fingers. He released Deke's wrist and, in one fluid motion, drove the knife's pommel into the nerve cluster at the base of Deke's neck. Deke made no sound. His eyes rolled back and his body folded, collapsing to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. It was over. The entire engagement, from Eleanor's pull to Deke's fall, had taken less than 3 seconds. The room did not fall silent. Deke was down, unconscious, but Bull was still screaming, a high, gargling sound of pain and terror as Rico held on. Jake Donovan did not rest. He did not pause. He had neutralized the immediate threat, but he had not secured the room. "Rico, out." His command was sharp, cutting through the chaos. Instantly, Rico released and leapt back, landing silently on the carpet. He stood at attention, his eyes locked on Bull, a low growl still rumbling in his chest, ready to re-engage. Bull clutched his arm, blood pouring through his fingers, his face a mask of white shock. "My arm. He broke my arm." "Stay on the floor or he'll finish you," Jake said, his voice cold. He still held Deke's gun. He moved to Deke, his cobber still in his other hand. He used a set of nylon tactical restraints from his back pocket to methodically bind Deke's hands and feet. Then he moved to Bull, who was now sobbing, his bravado gone. Hands behind your back, now. Bull, his eyes on the dog, complied. Jake bound him just as tightly. The two primary threats were neutralized. Megan, a weak voice whispered from the floor. Jake's entire demeanor changed. The cold operator vanished. He tossed the gun safely onto a high shelf and was at Megan's side in an instant. I'm here, he said, his voice low and calm. You're safe. Help is on the way. Megan was dazed, her eyes struggling to focus. He saw the swelling on her head from where Bull had slammed her into the bed frame. He gently checked her pupils with his flashlight. Concussion, but alive. My mother, Megan whispered. Checking on her now. Stay still. He moved to Eleanor. She was in a heap by the wardrobe, her breathing shallow, her eyes closed. He saw the way she had fallen. His combat medic skills took over. Ma'am, he said softly. He didn't touch her head. He felt for the pulse in her neck, strong but rapid. Don't move, he said, his voice a gentle command. You could have a neck or back injury. He gently, professionally stabilized her head with his hands, keeping her spine in alignment. Just breathe, I've got you. That's when he heard them, faint in the distance, but growing louder. Sirens. Bull's screams had done the job. A neighbor had heard. Jake looked at the scene. 2 injured women, 2 subdued hostiles, 1 locked in the guest room. He looked at Rico. Watch. Rico sat on his haunches between Jake and the bound men, a silent, living wall. The sirens grew louder, stopping outside the house. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, painting the room in frantic, silent strobes. Port Sterling Police, this is the police. A voice boomed from a loudspeaker. Come out with your hands up. Jake couldn't move. He was stabilizing a patient. We're in the master bedroom. Upstairs. He yelled. Victims injured. Hostiles are down. We need medics now. There was a pause. Then the sound of heavy boots on the stairs. The police were coming in. A flashlight beam hit Jake in the face. He didn't flinch. In here. A uniformed officer, gun raised, appeared in the door. He was in his late 50s, with a tired face. This was Sergeant Miller. He'd seen everything Port Sterling had to offer, but he'd never seen this. He saw Jake, a civilian in dark clothes, calmly holding an elderly woman's head, looking like a combat medic. He saw a younger woman bleeding by the bed. He saw a massive German shepherd sitting guard. And he saw 2 men bound hand and foot with professional, non-standard restraints. Holy hell, Miller whispered. He lowered his gun. What on earth happened here? They broke in. 3 of them, Jake said, his voice calm, never taking his eyes off Eleanor. There's a third, unconscious, locked in the guest room down the hall. Key is in my pocket. These 2 are secured. The ladies need help now. Miller was speechless. He keyed his radio. I need 2 ambulances to this location and backup. We have multiple hostiles in custody. Scene is secure. Paramedics flooded the room, their faces grim. As they took over stabilizing Eleanor, Jake finally stood up. He moved to Megan, assisting her as another medic assessed her. Sergeant Miller went to Deke, who was starting to groan, his consciousness returning. Miller cuffed him. As the medics carefully lifted Eleanor onto a backboard, Deke's eyes focused. He saw her. He saw the flashing lights, the police, his world ending. And the resentment, the lie he had lived his whole life by, erupted. You! He screamed, his voice raw. He lunged, but the cuffs and Miller held him. You did this. This is all your fault. The medics paused. Megan cried out, Mom. Deke's eyes were wild, locked on Eleanor. You owe us. You owe my family. My father gave you 20 years. He was loyal. He was. Eleanor's pain-filled eyes opened. She looked at the man who had nearly killed her. She saw the boy he used to be, who played in her garden. Wait, she whispered to the paramedics. They stopped. The room was silent, save for Deke's ragged breathing. Eleanor's voice wasn't angry, it wasn't hateful. It was tired. It was the sound of a truth held for too long. Dylan, she said, her voice surprisingly clear. Deke froze. No one had called him that in years. Your father, Eleanor said, taking a pained breath. Your father was not loyal. He was a thief. Liar. Deke roared. He was caught, Eleanor continued, her voice taking on a sad, steely strength. He was caught trying to sell my husband's favorite pocket watch a week after his funeral. The blood drained from Deke's face. He knew that watch. His dad had it. He said it was a gift. We didn't call the police, Eleanor whispered, her eyes holding his. We should have, but we knew you were just a boy. We knew you had no one else. We did it out of pity. We did it for you. The truth landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't the Gables betrayal. It was the betrayal of his own father. His whole life, his rage, his victimhood, the very foundation of his existence, was a lie. He hadn't been fighting for justice. He'd been fighting for a ghost. Deke didn't scream. He didn't fight. The anger, the hate, the fire, it all went out. He simply collapsed, his legs giving way, his cuffed hands keeping him propped against the officer. He was broken. Sergeant Miller looked from the woman on the stretcher to the broken man he was holding and then to Jake. He had no more words. "Get her to the hospital," Jake said quietly to the paramedics. They nodded, silent, and carried her out. The Ohio sun, which had been hidden by clouds and darkness 3 days prior, now streamed through the tall windows of St. Joseph's Hospital. The light was bright, clean, and unforgiving, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Jake Donovan felt distinctly out of place. He stood in the sterile white hallway, his dark clothes and quiet intensity seeming to suck the light out of the air. He was used to darkness, to grit, to the sterile function of a forward operating base. The smell of floor wax and cafeteria food, the sound of daytime television, the cheerful, bustling nurses, felt like a foreign country. In his hand, he held a small, awkward bouquet of flowers, a last-minute purchase that felt inadequate. At his side, Rico was a model of perfect composure. The dog sat at his heel, his tail giving a single, polite thump on the linoleum floor. He was, as always, a disciplined extension of Jake himself. "Room 412, Jake said quietly, as if to himself. He took a breath and started walking. When they entered the room, the scene was one of quiet recovery. Eleanor Gable was not lying flat. She was propped up in the hospital bed, a dark bruise visible on her neck, but her eyes were sharp. Megan sat in a chair beside her, a fresh white bandage taped to her temple, a spectacular purple hue coloring her eye. They were not victims. They were survivors. The moment the door opened, both women looked up. Their expressions, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and a kind of awe, were directed not at Jake, but at the dog. Rico, sensing the environment, broke his heel command. He walked slowly, calmly, toward the bed. He didn't jump. He didn't bark. He simply stopped beside Eleanor and rested his heavy, intelligent head on the edge of her mattress. Eleanor's hand, thin and papery, came down to rest on his fur. "Hello, you magnificent thing," she whispered, her voice raspy. "Ma'am, Megan." Jake stepped forward, placing the flowers awkwardly on a side table. "I just wanted to see how you both were doing." "Better than I deserve," Eleanor said. Her voice was strong despite the pain. "The doctors say I have 2 cracked ribs and a spectacular collection of bruises. But my spine, thank God, is fine. Just a very hard knock." "And you, Megan?" Jake asked, turning to her. The woman who looked up at him was not the same one he'd seen cowering in fear. The trauma had burned away the last of her self-pity. She looked tired, and she looked hurt, but for the first time, she looked strong. "I have a concussion and a headache that could stop a freight train," Megan said, managing a faint smile. "But they say I'll be fine. We'll be fine." A slightly awkward silence settled. Jake, a man of action, felt lost in the aftermath. "I gave my statement to the police. To Sergeant Miller," he said. "He said they processed them all." "Dylan," Eleanor said, her eyes distant. "Dylan Harding. I remember him as a boy. A sad, angry little boy. To think of all that hate, all those years. And it was all built on a lie. He broke down," Megan said, her voice low. "When you were gone and they were taking him away, he was just weeping, not asking for a lawyer, not fighting, just broken. He kept saying, 'He lied to me. He lied to me my whole life.'" The room was quiet as they all contemplated the wreckage of 3 lives ruined by one man's petty theft and another's toxic pride. "The house is being repaired," Megan said, changing the subject. "The doorframe is shattered and the bedroom is a mess, but it's just stuff." Eleanor looked at her daughter, a deep, profound love passing between them. "It is just stuff, isn't it? Took me 70 years and 3 monsters in my bedroom to finally understand that." She looked at Jake. "We made a decision, Megan and I." Megan reached out and took her mother's hand. "We're selling the house." Jake was surprised. "It's your family home." "It was," Eleanor said with finality. "Now it's a building. It's too big, too many ghosts. Not just these ghosts, but all of them. My husband, my parents. It's time to let it go. And the locket? Jake asked. The police found it in the safe. That, Eleanor said with the first real sparkle in her eye, is the best part. I'm selling that, too. That ridiculous, troublesome, beautiful stone. It's brought us nothing but grief. I'm using the money to set Megan up. Megan looked at her mother, her eyes shining. She wants me to open the little bookstore I've always dreamed of down by the waterfront. A new start, Eleanor said. For both of us. We wouldn't have that chance, Mr. Donovan, if not for you. Jake looked uncomfortable with the gratitude. I was in the right place and I had the right partner. He nodded toward Rico, who was now getting a thorough scratch behind the ears from Eleanor. My leave is over, Jake said, the real reason for his visit finally emerging. I fly out tonight. Back to work. Eleanor and Megan's expressions sobered. They understood. They had seen his work firsthand. The reality of what he was returning to hung in the air. Then you're not going empty-handed, Eleanor said. She nodded at a small box on her bedside table. Megan, dear, if you would. Megan handed her the small, polished wooden box. Eleanor offered it to Jake. I can't accept anything, Jake said, shaking his head. This isn't a payment, Eleanor said, her voice firm as the matriarch returned. This is a keepsake. Open it. Jake took the box. He opened the lid. Inside, on a bed of faded blue velvet, was a small, heavy, antique brass compass. It was beautiful, but it was clearly a tool. It was well worn, its edges softened by time and use. It was my husband's, Eleanor said softly. He was a sailor in his youth, on the Great Lakes, not a soldier like you, but he knew the world was a big, dangerous, and confusing place. He said this compass. It always knew the way home, even when he didn't. She looked at him, her eyes clear and strong. You saved our home, Jake. You saved our lives. Let this guide you home, from whatever darkness you find yourself in. That's an order. Jake looked at the compass, then at this extraordinary woman. He felt a crack in his professional armor, a warmth he wasn't accustomed to. He slowly closed his hand around the compass, the heavy brass feeling warm in his palm.
I can't, he started.
You will, she insisted. He gave a single, sharp nod. Thank you, ma'am. I'll treasure it. He stood to leave. The mission was over. He gave a small command and Rico lifted his head from the bed, moving back to his side. Jake and Rico stood in the doorway. They looked back at the two women, sitting in the bright afternoon sun. Good luck with the bookstore, Megan, Jake said. Megan stood up, wincing slightly, and did something that surprised them all. She walked over and gave Jake a quick, fierce hug. Come back and visit, she whispered. We'll give you a discount. Then she knelt and wrapped her arms around Rico's thick neck, burying her face in his fur. And you, my hero, you come back, too. Rico, for the first time, broke his discipline. He gave her hand a single, soft lick. Jake and his dog left the room. Eleanor and Megan sat in the silence, bathed in the sun. Megan went back to her chair, taking her mother's hand. He's quite a man, Megan said. They both are, Eleanor replied. And for the first time in a long time, they sat together and smiled, not with fear or sadness or regret. They smiled at the bright, clean, and powerful light of a new day.